late 1950s, the Boston Redevelopment Authority decided to rebuild Boston's West End, making way for modern apartments. West Enders did not approve of the demolition plans, but the BRA executed their plans anyways, forcing hundreds of families to vacate the neighborhood, with little compensation and no place to go. Compromise came decades later when some former residents were given a chance to return to the West End. The West End, which was located beside the Charles River, became a culturally diverse district in the 20th century. The majority of the population was Irish, Italian, Polish, and Jewish, among more than 40 ethnic groups living in a 50-acre proximity. Despite the differences among the residents, the Boston neighborhood was considered a tight-knit community.
We were a mixture of many nationalities, many races, colors of skin. We were teachers and artists, we were waitresses and plumbers, we were retired bankers, all sorts of people.
I think the West End was, at that time, the true meaning of the term melting pot. It was.
Some residents of wealthier sections of Boston, who also happened to be city officials, regarded the West End as a slum. This perception became more of a reality when at one point, garbage collection and street cleaning for the neighborhood were canceled. In some parts of the West End, poverty and time in general had taken a toll on the old homes and apartment buildings, and the neighborhood's overall appearance. But in most ways, the West End did not fit the definition of slum. There were few street fights or crime, and not everyone that lived there was poor. Nonetheless, those intent on redeveloping Boston had the West End in their sights.
The old and decaying parts of a city, and Boston has some, must be replaced. You must keep pace with the glitter of new cities. The process by which this is done is called urban renewal.
Urban renewal became popular after World War II as American cities began to compete for the most modern infrastructure to attract businesses. In order to redevelop an area, the government must expropriate the property from the owner. Legally, this can only occur under eminent domain, a right of the federal government to seize private property for public use. In the colonial era of America, the English government could take property as they pleased. But when the Bill of Rights was written, property owners were given some protections. The Fifth Amendment, written by James Madison, states, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." The 1949 Housing Act, signed by President Harry Truman, encouraged the government to take property considered as a slum and use it to make a city more attractive. The passing of this act kick-started urban renewal projects in Boston. Law could force those living in rundown areas to abandon their homes in the name of eminent domain. The northeast corner of the South End, commonly referred to as the New York Streets, was Boston's first urban renewal project in the 50s. The roads named after the cities along the Erie Canal were completely demolished by 1957 and replaced with the new Boston Herald Traveler newspaper plant and other industrial facilities. After the South End urban renewal project was completed, the BRI set their sights on the West End.
There's only one way that the West End could have gone, and it was down. The people there were getting poorer, the tenements there were falling down, the fire hazard was increasing. There's only one way you can cure a place like the West End, and that is to wipe it out. It's of cancer in the long run on the community. This may seem ruthless, but this is an aspect of urban renewal.
Multiple people had proposed urban renewal projects for the West End in the early 1900s. However, not until the 1950s were the plans politically achievable. The Boston Housing Authority and the mayor of Boston, John Hines, announced in 1953 that the West End was to be rebuilt and replaced with high-rise apartments. West End citizens were extremely upset with this decision.
I don't want no money. I want my home.
The mayor's chief of staff, Jerome Rappaport, was especially despised within the West End community. The story that the media neglected to tell was that the money made off of the West End was benefiting Rappaport. He, along with Boston's business leaders, promoted the plan of the redevelopment of the West End. Rappaport later left the Hines administration, but was soon hired back as the developer of Charles River Park, which would be built in place of the West End. The Save the West End Committee was a group made up of West Enders devoted to trying to save the West End from its demise. They didn't believe the West End should be classified as a slum, but they lacked political power and could do little to prevent the destruction of their homes.
Well, we were one of the lucky families because our family had a home in Winthrop that we could go to. We did not go to it because we hung around Boston because my grandmother would refuse to leave her house. And we were afraid to leave her alone.
The original plan was to relocate residents over 4 years, but almost everyone was driven out in just 18 months. Like Mary Kennedy's grandmother, some residents refused to leave until the wrecking ball came. Elizabeth Kearney Blood was the last resident of the West End. After a well-publicized, month-long standoff with the city, Blood and her 2 daughters finally departed. After the West End was destroyed, Rappaport and other developers built a complex of moderate-income high-rise apartments, which many people in the West End couldn't afford. In fact, the government gave West End homeowners little to no compensation for their homes. This left the West End community scattered and broken beyond repair.
Given the fact that we had no choice, we were forced to move. We got no assistance whatsoever in terms of any financial assistance, nor did we get, when I say we, I'm talking about West Enders in general, nor did anybody get any assistance in finding a new place to live, all of which was promised to us, but the government never came through with any of that.
There was plenty of conflict surrounding the urban renewal of the West End.
Do not get mad for nobody.
But where was the compromise? It wasn't until 30 years later that West End residents were finally given the opportunity to go back when the West End Place was constructed, a mixed-income housing unit with 43 apartments set aside for West Enders. Space for a museum dedicated to the West End was also set aside. Finally, in 2015, the Boston Redevelopment Authority officially apologized for the displacement of the neighborhood. But the real compromise was that after the hugely unpopular West End urban renewal project, the Redevelopment Authority was forced to change the way they did things. 60 years later, we have an opportunity to apply the tools of urban renewal more judiciously to foster growth in a way that is thoughtful and respectful towards the community. We don't seek to erase past blemishes or hide our faults. We seek to learn from them.
I'm going down to the West End to lose my West End blues.
If you drive through Boston now and you see that sign, if you lived here, you're home, and every time I see it, I say, I did live here, I was home.